The silent departure. The Galactic Unity Assembly Chamber stretched across 3 miles of polished crystal floors. Its ceiling disappeared into artificial clouds that shifted colors with each speaker's words. 243 species called this place the center of civilization. They gathered here to make decisions that affected trillions of lives across thousands of worlds. The air hummed with translation devices working in real time, turning countless languages into something everyone could understand. Ambassador Chen Wei stood on the human platform, her posture straight despite the weight of 28 years pressing on her shoulders. She wore the simple gray uniform that all human diplomats chose, unmarked except for a small Earth symbol on the collar. Her black hair, now streaked with silver, was pulled back in a practical style. Her face showed no emotion as she waited for the vote results. Behind her stood the rest of the human delegation. Dr. Rachel Morrison, Chief Medical Liaison, folded her hands calmly. Commander David Torres, Military Coordinator, kept his eyes forward. Economic Advisor Lu Feng adjusted his glasses and checked his tablet one last time. Cultural Representative Maria Santos took a slow breath and maintained her diplomatic smile. They had all been here before. They had stood on this platform hundreds of times, making requests that seemed reasonable to them. Equal access to trade routes. Fair representation in security decisions. The same rights that other member species enjoyed without question. Each time, the answer had been the same. Supreme Coordinator Thelzareth rose from the central platform. He belonged to the Corvani species, beings with 4 arms and skin that shimmered like oil on water. His species had founded the Assembly 6,000 years ago. They considered themselves the natural leaders of galactic civilization. His voice echoed through the chamber with the authority of ancient tradition. The human petition regarding equal access to the Nebula Corridor resources is hereby rejected, he announced. Junior member species must demonstrate greater maturity before assuming such responsibilities. The Corvani motion to maintain current restrictions has passed with 212 votes in favor, 18 against, and 13 abstentions. Laughter rippled through parts of the chamber. Not loud, not cruel, but casual. The kind of laughter that comes when something predictable happens. Several delegates didn't bother hiding their amusement. The Vrexian representative made a chittering sound that his species used to express condescension. A pale Nix delegate whispered something to her neighbor, and both turned to look at the human platform with expressions that needed no translation. Ambassador Chen listened to every second of it. She had learned to count the moments of mockery over the years. This one lasted 14 seconds before fading into the general noise of the chamber. She had experienced worse. There had been sessions where delegates openly mocked human appearance, calling them barely upright primates or the species that thinks it belongs here. There had been votes where human proposals were rejected before anyone even read them. Chen reached down and picked up her document case. She organized her materials with careful precision, each paper aligned perfectly before she placed it in the case. She closed it with a soft click that somehow carried in the vast chamber. The small sound made several nearby delegates glance her way. She stood and gave a single bow to the assembly. It was the traditional human gesture of respect, one she had offered at the end of every session for 28 years. Her movements were graceful and deliberate. Then she turned toward the exit. Dr. Morrison stood and followed. Her medical bag hung from her shoulder, filled with research she had been sharing freely with assembly physicians for 2 decades. Commander Torres rose next, his military decorations catching the light. He had commanded joint defense operations that saved millions of assembly citizens. Lu Feng gathered his economic reports, documents that had helped stabilize currency markets across 17 sectors. Maria Santos was last, pausing only to give one final look at the chamber where she had worked to build cultural bridges for so long. They walked toward the exit in single file. Their footsteps on the crystal floor created a rhythm that filled the growing silence. Delegates stopped their conversations to watch. Some looked confused. Others seemed curious. A few appeared vaguely uncomfortable, though they couldn't have explained why. At the doorway, Ambassador Chen paused. For just a moment, it seemed she might turn back. She might speak. She might offer some final statement or protest or plea. But she simply stepped through the doorway and disappeared from view. The others followed without a word. The chamber remained quiet for perhaps 10 seconds. Then Supreme Coordinator Thelzareth waved one of his 4 hands dismissively. Young species often react emotionally to disappointment, he said. They will submit a formal apology within the week and return to their duties. This happens occasionally with junior members. We should proceed with the next agenda item. The assembly moved on to discuss mining rights in the outer spiral. The human delegation was quickly forgotten. But something had begun that none of them understood. In human facilities across assembly space, quiet activity had started. At research stations and trade outposts, at military bases and diplomatic compounds, humans began packing. They worked efficiently and without drama. They organized their belongings, backed up their research, and prepared to leave. They did not send angry messages. They did not issue demands or ultimatums. They did not threaten or complain. They simply began the process of departure with the same quiet competence they had always shown. On the third day after the vote, the first human station went dark. It was a small medical research facility in the Beta sector. Ships arrived to find it empty and clean. All equipment had been removed or properly shut down. All research materials were gone. The station's computer systems had been wiped, leaving only basic operational data. A single message appeared on the main screen: "Thank you for the opportunity to serve. Farewell." By the end of the first week, 17 human facilities had been evacuated. All communication channels to human ships returned only silence. Messages sent to human personnel received no response. It was as if humans had simply stopped existing within assembly space. Supreme Coordinator Thelzareth called an emergency session on the 8th day. The chamber filled quickly as delegates arrived to understand what was happening. Thelzareth's skin shifted through colors that indicated confusion and growing concern. "Explain this situation," he demanded of his intelligence chief, a Vrexian named Skithtal. "Why have the humans stopped communicating?" Skithtal's compound eyes reflected light as he consulted his data tablet. "Supreme Coordinator, we have attempted contact through all standard channels. Human ships do not respond. Human stations are being systematically abandoned. We estimate that within 2 weeks, there will be no human presence remaining in assembly space." "This is absurd," said the Pale Nix delegate. "They are throwing a tantrum because one vote didn't go their way. Send security forces to their facilities and order them to remain at their posts." "We tried," Skithtal said quietly. "When our ships arrived at human stations, they found them already empty. The humans are not breaking any laws. They are simply leaving." Thelzareth leaned forward. "Then send ships to their home systems. Send diplomatic envoys to Earth itself. Offer them better terms if that's what they need. Make it clear that their reaction is disproportionate to the situation." The chamber fell silent. Skithtal's skin color changed to a pale shade that his species used to show embarrassment. "Supreme Coordinator, we cannot send ships to Earth." "Why not?" "Because we do not know where Earth is located." The silence deepened. Delegates looked at each other with expressions ranging from confusion to disbelief. The Corvani delegate beside Thelzareth spoke up. "That's impossible. Humans have been members of this assembly for 28 years. Obviously we know where their home system is." Skithtal activated a holographic display. It showed the known galaxy with all assembly member territories marked in various colors. Trade routes connected them like glowing threads. Every system was documented and labeled. Except for one area. In what should have been human territory, there was only a gray unmarked region with a simple label: human-administered space. "This is all we have," Skithtal explained. "In 28 years of human membership, not a single assembly vessel has ever visited Earth or any human colony. We have no coordinates. We have no navigation data. We have no star charts of their territory." A Vrexian delegate clicked his mandibles in confusion. "But humans came here. They attended sessions. They worked at our facilities. Surely we tracked where they came from." "Human ships always arrive through neutral jump points," Skithtal said. "Standard routes that any species could use. Their departure vectors were never recorded because no one considered it important. All messages to human space were routed through communication relay stations. We never had direct access to their networks." Thelzareth stared at the gray blob on the star map. His four hands clenched slowly. "Are you telling me that in 28 years, not one assembly member ever visited a human world?" "That is correct, Supreme Coordinator. But surely we received invitations. Cultural exchange programs. Diplomatic visits. These are standard protocols." Skithtal pulled up another file. "Yes, Supreme Coordinator. We have records of 3,156 invitations from human authorities over 28 years. Invitations to visit Earth. Invitations to human cultural celebrations. Invitations to tour human colonies and research facilities. Invitations to academic conferences and artistic exhibitions. And not a single invitation was accepted. Most were formally declined. Many were simply ignored." The chamber remained silent as that information settled over the delegates. Someone in the back rows made a small sound of distress. A delegate from a younger species whispered to her neighbor. The Pale Nix representative who had suggested sending security forces suddenly found her data tablet very interesting. Thelzaratha's skin shifted through several colors rapidly, a sign of emotional turmoil in his species. Begin a comprehensive search immediately. Use every resource available. Find Earth. Find any human colony. Send ships to every system in that region if necessary. Supreme Coordinator, Skiftal said carefully, that region contains approximately 4,000 star systems. A comprehensive search could take years. Then begin now. Over the following days, the situation grew worse. More human facilities emptied. Human trade ships that had been reliable fixtures on commercial routes simply disappeared. Human physicians left their hospital positions. Human engineers abandoned their projects. Human teachers closed their classrooms. Human soldiers withdrew from joint military operations. They left everything organized and clean. They completed emergency tasks to ensure no immediate disasters. They transferred critical patients to non-human doctors. They finished repairs that couldn't be delayed. But then they left, and they did not come back. By the end of the second week, assembly space was completely empty of human presence. Search teams found nothing but abandoned facilities and silence. The humans had not threatened war. They had not demanded anything. They had not issued dramatic statements or manifestos. They had simply walked away. In his private office, Supreme Coordinator Thelzarath reviewed files that his staff had compiled. Lists of human contributions to the assembly over 28 years. The documents made uncomfortable reading. Humans had served on every major project. They had volunteered for the most difficult assignments. They had worked in dangerous regions that other species avoided. They had saved lives, built infrastructure, conducted research, negotiated peace, and asked for very little in return. And the assembly had given them even less. One file caught his attention. It was a personnel record for a human named Dr. James Park. He had worked as a medical researcher at a Corvani hospital for 18 years. His research had led to treatments for 3 previously incurable diseases. He had trained dozens of Corvani physicians. He had worked 18-hour days and never complained. When Dr. Park had been nominated for a prestigious medical award, his nomination had been rejected because junior species members should not receive honors above their station. He had continued his work anyway. Now he was gone, and the hospital was struggling to maintain the treatment protocols he had established. Thelzarath closed the file and stared out his window at the stars. Somewhere out there, humanity was continuing their lives without the assembly. They were helping someone, building something, creating and discovering and serving. Just not here. Not anymore. And for the first time in his long career, Supreme Coordinator Thelzarath felt something he had never experienced before. He felt the cold weight of a mistake that could not be undone. He felt regret. The humans had not argued. They had simply left. And in their silence, they had spoken louder than any protest ever could. The unraveling and regret. 3 months had passed since the last human ship departed from assembly space. Supreme Coordinator Thelzarath had aged in ways that surprised even himself. His shimmering skin had dulled to a flat gray that his species associated with deep stress. He sat in emergency session after emergency session, watching his carefully ordered civilization begin to crack at the foundations. The first major crisis emerged from the medical sector. It started at the Corvani Central Hospital on Prime Station, the finest medical facility in assembly space. Dr. Velkera, the head physician, sent an urgent message that arrived marked with the highest priority coding. "We have a problem," the message began simply. "The radiation treatment protocols are failing." Dr. Sarah Chen had worked at that hospital for 23 years. She had arrived as a young researcher with bright eyes and an eagerness to learn from the advanced Corvani medical establishment. Instead, she had ended up teaching them. Her specialty had been radiation exposure, something humans understood better than most species because of their violent early history with nuclear technology. Sarah had developed a complete treatment system for radiation poisoning. Not just one medicine, but an entire network of therapies that worked together. She had created protocols for different species, different exposure levels, different circumstances. Her system had saved thousands of lives over 2 decades. She had tried to teach it to others, offering workshops and writing detailed manuals. But Corvani physicians had a certain pride. They had been practicing medicine for 6,000 years before humans even discovered fire. They had attended her workshops politely, nodded at her manuals, and then continued doing things their own way. After all, they reasoned, they could always ask Dr. Chen if they needed help. Now Dr. Chen was gone. Her research files were gone. Her carefully calibrated equipment was gone. And patients were dying. Dr. Velkera's second message arrived 3 days later. "We have 47 patients in critical condition. We cannot replicate Dr. Chen's treatments. We tried to follow her published papers, but there are gaps in the procedures that we don't understand. We believe she simplified the publications to make them easier to read, assuming she would be available to explain the complex parts. We need her back immediately. But Sarah Chen was somewhere beyond the gray blob on the star charts. Her communication codes returned only silence. The 47 patients died over the next 2 weeks. Then more arrived. Radiation exposure was common in space travel. The death toll climbed. Similar messages began flooding in from across assembly space. On the Vrection homeworld, the central computer network started experiencing critical failures. For 15 years, a human systems engineer named Marcus Webb had been quietly maintaining the network. He had discovered that Vrection computing architecture had fundamental flaws in how it handled data routing. The flaws weren't obvious because they only appeared under very specific conditions. Marcus had fixed the problems without making a fuss about it. He had implemented patches and updates that prevented the flaws from causing crashes. He had done this work almost invisibly, during maintenance windows when no one paid attention. He had submitted reports about the underlying issues and suggested a complete system redesign, but those reports had been filed away and forgotten. The Vrection Technology Council had more important matters to address than the concerns of a human engineer. Now Marcus was gone, and his patches were failing. The Vrection network began crashing multiple times per day. Financial transactions were lost. Communication systems went dark for hours at a time. Government operations ground to a halt. Vrection engineers tried desperately to understand what Marcus had been doing, but his work was so deeply integrated into the system that they couldn't separate it from the original architecture. The Vrection delegate stood before the assembly with his compound eyes dim with exhaustion. "We need Marcus Webb to return," he stated flatly. "Our entire planetary infrastructure depends on his work. Without him, our civilization may collapse within months." But Marcus Webb was somewhere else, probably fixing someone else's computers, probably helping someone who appreciated his expertise. The agricultural crisis hit 15 colony worlds simultaneously. These worlds had been barren moons and asteroids just 2 decades ago. The assembly had attempted to terraform them as part of an ambitious colonization program. The initial efforts had failed completely. Nothing would grow. The soil was dead. Water management systems didn't work properly. The colonies had been on the verge of abandonment. Then the Rodriguez family had arrived. Miguel and Carmen Rodriguez were farmers from Earth, simple people who had spent their lives working with soil and water. They had volunteered for the colony assistance program along with their 3 children. They brought no fancy degrees or advanced technology. They just brought knowledge passed down through generations of farming. Miguel had a gift for reading land. He could examine dead soil and understand what it needed to support life. He knew about mineral balance and microbial ecosystems and drainage patterns. Carmen understood water in ways that no computer model could match. She knew how water moved through different types of soil, how it interacted with plants, how to build systems that worked with nature instead of against it. Together with their children, they had traveled between the 15 colonies for 20 years. They had transformed each one from dead rock into productive farmland. They had created ecosystems that sustained billions of people. They had begged the assembly to let them train local farmers, to pass on their knowledge before it was too late. The assembly had refused. Security concerns, they said. Agricultural knowledge was strategic information. Humans couldn't be allowed too much influence over food production. The Rodriguez family could do the work themselves, but they couldn't teach others. So they had done the work themselves, year after year, never complaining. They had watched their children grow up traveling between dead worlds and bringing them to life. They had poured their hearts into soil that wasn't even their own. Now they were gone. Within 6 weeks, the crops on all 15 colonies began to fail. The carefully balanced soil started turning sour. Water systems that had worked perfectly for years suddenly malfunctioned. Local farmers tried everything they knew, but they had never learned the methods that made the colony successful. They had been forbidden from learning. Food prices across that entire sector increased by 400% within 2 months. Riots broke out on 3 of the colonies. 2 colonial governors resigned in disgrace. The Assembly emergency food reserves, meant to last 5 years, were projected to run out in 18 months. The military situation was perhaps the worst of all. The Kreshnai were a warrior species that lived beyond Assembly borders. For 300 years, they had raided Assembly space, attacking trade ships and border colonies. They were fierce and numerous and utterly without mercy. Every military strategy the Assembly had tried had failed to stop them. Then Lieutenant Commander James Park had requested permission to try something different. Instead of fighting the Kreshnai, he wanted to talk to them. The Assembly Military Council had laughed at the suggestion. Talk to raiders? Negotiate with pirates? Impossible. But they had let him try anyway because nothing else was working. James had spent 2 years learning the Kreshnai language. He had studied their culture and history. He had discovered something that the assembly had never bothered to learn. The Kreshnai weren't raiding because they were evil or chaotic. They were raiding because they were desperate. Their home systems were failing. Their worlds were dying. They attacked others because they saw no other way to survive. James had opened communication channels. He had arranged meetings in neutral space. He had negotiated deals that provided the Kreshnai with food and medical supplies in exchange for peace. It had taken 3 more years of careful diplomacy, but eventually the raids had stopped. For the past 12 years, there had been almost complete peace on the assembly borders. Most assembly members had forgotten the Kreshnai even existed. They assumed the raiders had simply given up or gone elsewhere. They never realized that James Park spent weeks every year in Kreshnai space, maintaining relationships, ensuring the agreements held, solving problems before they became conflicts. Now James was gone. The Kreshnai had sent ambassadors to assembly space looking for him. They had questions about the next supply shipment. They had concerns about a disease spreading through their colonies. They needed help, and their human friend wasn't answering. The assembly had no one else who spoke Kreshnai. No one else who understood their culture. No one else they trusted. Within 8 weeks, the first raids began again. Within 3 months, Kreshnai fleets had attacked 18 colonies and destroyed 47 trade ships. Thousands died. The careful peace that James had built over 15 years was shattered. The Assembly Military Council met in emergency session. They discussed strategies and tactics and force deployments. They talked for hours about how to defeat the Kreshnai. Not one of them suggested trying to talk to the raiders. They had learned nothing. Supreme Coordinator Thelzareth received reports every day now. Each one detailed another crisis, another system failing, another critical problem that couldn't be solved. He had ordered a complete historical analysis of human contributions to the assembly, hoping to understand what had gone wrong. The report arrived on the 95th day after the human departure. It was 8,000 pages long. Thelzareth read it over 5 sleepless nights. Each page was worse than the last. The report documented every human contribution over 28 years. Every life saved, every system built, every problem solved, every crisis averted. The humans had been everywhere, doing everything, holding the assembly together in 1,000 ways that no one had noticed. Engineer Yuki Tanaka had maintained the assembly's power grid for 19 years. She had prevented 6 major blackouts through her careful monitoring and quick responses. She had trained for none of those emergencies because the assembly had refused to give humans access to crisis training programs. She had simply been competent and dedicated. Now the power grid was unstable, and blackouts were becoming common. Teacher Maria Santos had created the Cultural Integration Program that helped young species adapt to assembly society. She had taught thousands of students from dozens of species. Her classroom had been a place where different cultures learned to understand each other. After she left, the program collapsed. No one else had her gift for building bridges between different ways of thinking. Scientist David Kim had discovered the mathematical principles that made faster-than-light communication possible across galactic distances. His work had revolutionized assembly communication systems. He had published his research freely, asking for nothing in return. When he was nominated for the highest scientific honor the assembly could give, the nomination had been rejected because giving such an honor to a human would set a dangerous precedent. The report included a section that made Thelzareth feel physically ill. It was titled, "Rejected Invitations and Ignored Offers of Friendship." The humans had invited assembly members to Earth 3,156 times. They had invited individual delegates to their homes, to their celebrations, to their cultural events. They had offered to share their art, their music, their food, their traditions. Every single invitation had been rejected or ignored. Not one assembly member had ever visited Earth. Not one had attended a human wedding or funeral or birthday celebration. Not one had eaten a meal in a human home or listened to human music or read human poetry. When human diplomats had invited colleagues to dinner, those colleagues had suddenly remembered prior commitments. When human scientists had offered collaboration opportunities, they had been told that human research wasn't sophisticated enough to warrant partnership. When human soldiers had saved alien lives in combat, they had received automated thank you messages with no signatures. The humans had stayed anyway. They had continued serving, continued hoping, continued believing that eventually their work would be recognized and valued. They had endured 28 years of casual contempt and systematic dismissal. They had smiled and bowed and said, "Thank you for the opportunity to serve." Until the day they stopped. New reports began arriving from independent traders and explorers who traveled beyond assembly space. They spoke of human ships in distant sectors, offering medical care to plague-stricken worlds. They spoke of human engineers repairing broken stations without requesting payment. They spoke of human teachers establishing schools on primitive worlds. They spoke of human soldiers protecting convoys from pirates and refusing any reward. The humans hadn't stopped being helpful. They hadn't stopped being kind or generous or dedicated. They had simply stopped wasting those qualities on people who didn't value them. One report particularly caught Thelzaratha's attention. It came from a Palnix trader who had been traveling through the outer reaches, far from Assembly territory. She described encountering a human medical ship near a system that the Assembly had declared too dangerous and poor to be worth helping. The humans were evacuating a world threatened by an asteroid impact, the trader reported. They had been working for 6 months to move 4 billion people to safety. I asked the human captain why they were bothering with a species that had nothing to offer in return. She looked at me like I had asked why water was wet. Because they need help, she said. Isn't that reason enough? Thelzarath read that report 3 times. He thought about the vote on the Nebula Corridor, the vote that had triggered the human departure. The humans had simply asked for equal access to resources. They had asked to be treated the same as every other Assembly member. They had asked for basic fairness. And the Assembly had laughed at them. He thought about Ambassador Chenwei, standing on the human platform with 28 years of patient service behind her. He thought about how she had bowed one final time before walking away. He wondered what she had been thinking in that moment. Had she been angry? Sad? Relieved? He would never know because he had never bothered to ask her about her feelings in 28 years of working together. The economic reports were devastating. Assembly trade networks had contracted by 38%. Medical capacity was down by 42%. Agricultural output had fallen by 51% in the affected colonies. Border security was compromised across 17 sectors. Power systems were unreliable. Communication networks were failing. Research programs were stalling. 3 member species had formally withdrawn from the Assembly, citing its inability to provide basic services and security. 5 more were considering withdrawal. The carefully constructed galactic civilization that had lasted 6,000 years was coming apart. And somewhere beyond the gray blob on the star charts, humanity was building something new. They were forming relationships with species who appreciated them. They were creating friendships with people who valued their contributions. They were helping those who welcomed their help. Supreme Coordinator Thelzarath called one final emergency session. The chamber was less full than it had been 3 months ago. Some delegates had stopped attending. Others looked tired and defeated. The energy that had once filled this space had drained away. We need to discuss our options, Thelzarath began. His voice echoed in the vast chamber, sounding small and lost. We need to find a way to convince the humans to return. The Vrexian delegate spoke up, his voice bitter. Why would they return? We treated them like servants for 28 years. We mocked them. We rejected their every request. We ignored their invitations and dismissed their contributions. We never even visited their worlds. Why would they come back to that? No one had an answer. We should offer them full membership rights, suggested a younger delegate. Voting privileges. Equal status. Everything they asked for. They didn't leave because they wanted better terms, Thelzarath said quietly. They left because we showed them, every day for 28 years, that we didn't value them. That we didn't respect them. That we didn't see them as equals no matter what they did or how hard they tried. Offering them rights now doesn't change what we are. The chamber fell silent. In that silence, every delegate confronted the same uncomfortable truth. The humans hadn't failed the Assembly. The Assembly had failed the humans. They had taken kindness for weakness. They had mistaken patience for insignificance. They had assumed that beings who served without demanding recognition were beings who didn't deserve recognition. They had been wrong about everything. Thelzarath looked around the chamber at the representatives of 243 species. 6,000 years of civilization. Countless achievements and wonders. And they had driven away the one species that might have held them all together, simply because that species had been too humble to demand the respect they deserved. The search teams were still looking for Earth. They had been searching for 3 months and had found nothing. They would probably search for years more and find nothing. Because somewhere out there, humanity had closed the door on the Assembly. They had walked away from contempt and mockery and casual cruelty. They had chosen dignity over acceptance. And the Assembly was left to face the consequences of its own arrogance, sitting in a magnificent chamber that suddenly felt very empty, ruling over a civilization that was slowly collapsing, searching desperately for people who had no reason to ever come back. Supreme Coordinator Thelzarath adjourned the session early. There was nothing more to say. He returned to his office and stared out at the stars, wondering which one of those distant lights might be Sol, the human home star. Wondering if somewhere around that star, Ambassador Chenwei was beginning a new life with people who valued her service. He hoped she was happy. It was the least she deserved after everything the assembly had put her through. It was the very least. The humans had not argued. They had just left. And in their absence, they had taught the Galactic Unity Assembly a lesson that no amount of discussion or debate could have conveyed. Some mistakes cannot be undone. Some opportunities, once lost, never return. And some species, once they walk away, are gone forever.